Most people believe the flood was God's first judgment on the earth, the moment he wiped everything clean. But the Bible never actually says that. It never calls the flood the beginning of judgment or introduces it as the initial destruction. Strangely, it never treats it like the first collapse of order. Genesis opens with an earth that's already broken, formless, empty, submerged, and silent. That's how aftermaths sound, not beginnings. What's unsettling is this. Scripture speaks about judgment as if it's already familiar, as if something catastrophic happened before, and no explanation is given. If the flood was truly the first judgment, Genesis should read like a fresh start. But it doesn't. It reads like a story that started after something went wrong. That tension, that inconsistency, is where the Bible stops explaining and expects you to notice. If this is true, if the flood wasn't the first judgment, then why does Scripture talk this way? Why does Genesis open without introducing chaos but assuming it? Why describe the earth as already ruined instead of becoming ruined? If judgment hadn't happened yet, why does the language sound like aftermath? Here's the uncomfortable part. The Bible never explains why the world is in that state. It doesn't defend God or justify what you're about to read. It just moves on, as if the reader knows something. If the flood was the first time God destroyed the earth, why does Genesis use words that Scripture later reserves for devastation, curse, and judgment? Why does God restore, order instead of creating it from nothing? Why separate light from darkness if both already exist? If nothing had gone wrong, what is being restrained? And then there's this. Why does Scripture speak of rulers, thrones, and authority long before Noah? Why reference beings present when the earth's foundations were laid, watching, reacting, rejoicing? Who were they ruling over? If humans weren't there, then who was accountable? If no one was accountable, why does the Bible sound like judgment already happened? The text doesn't argue for this. It doesn't announce it or warn you. It speaks as though destruction is not new but familiar. That makes this dangerous to ignore. If Genesis assumes a judgment before the flood, then the flood isn't the beginning of God's justice. It's a continuation. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now let's slow down, not to interpret or theorize, but to read. The moment you start arguing for this idea, you risk losing it. The Bible doesn't argue, it assumes. Assumptions work when something is already known. Let's start where Scripture points us. Job chapter 38. God is speaking, not explaining creation but correcting Job. This matters. God isn't teaching theology, he's confronting presumption. He asks, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" That question establishes distance. Job wasn't there. But then God does something unexpected. He describes the foundations of the earth being laid while others were present. He speaks of witnesses, of rejoicing, of awareness. Notice what the text does not do. It doesn't introduce these beings or define them. The text doesn't interpret this. It assumes you already know. Now keep that in mind and move to Isaiah 45:18. Here God states plainly, He did not create the earth to be tohu. Not He fixed it later, or it became something else eventually. He did not create it that way. The verse isn't emotional, it's declarative. This creates a problem. Genesis 1:2 describes the earth as tohu. The Bible places both statements side by side without resolving that tension. Again, it doesn't explain, because the text doesn't interpret this. It assumes you already know. Now move to Jeremiah 4:23. The prophet uses the same Hebrew phrase found in Genesis 1:2. Tohu bohu. Here there's no debate. Jeremiah isn't describing creation, he's describing judgment. Cities are destroyed, life is gone, light is withdrawn. The context is unmistakable. Scripture is interpreting Scripture for you, and it assumes you already know. Now consider Noah. When the flood comes, Scripture explains why: human wickedness, violence, and corruption. God speaks, warns, and gives timelines. The flood is narrated, motivated, and explained. Genesis 1 is not. There are no warnings, accusations, or explanations, just condition. This tells you something important. Whatever happened before Genesis 1:2, Scripture treats it as settled history. Now let's widen the lens slightly to Ezekiel 28. This passage uses administrative language, access, placement, removal, an anointed cherub. Anointed is not poetic, it's office language. Cherub is not symbolic, it's rank. The text describes this being walking among stones of fire, positioned on the mountain of God. Government language, jurisdiction language. And again, no explanation. The text doesn't say when, how long, or anchor this to Eden or Adam, because it assumes you already know. Isaiah 14 does the same thing. I will ascend. I will exalt. I will sit. This isn't creation language, it's ambition within a hierarchy. You don't overthrow chaos, you overthrow order. Scripture never stops to argue the point. Authority isn't in the narrator, it's in the text. This isn't a theory introduced, it's a pattern noticed. The Bible speaks consistently of authority existing, rebellion occurring, judgment following, and restoration afterward, long before humanity enters the story. Not to shock you, but to help you recognize the framework. Genesis never explains the chaos, because restoration doesn't need an introduction, it needs a steward. Humanity's role suddenly feels heavier. Adam isn't the hero of a brand new world, he is the caretaker of a world that has already known loss. That realization widens the story without resolving it. You're not given answers, you're given scale. Genesis isn't small, it's enormous. It's not the start of conflict, it's the continuation of one. Now the question is, what did God create? It's what went wrong before this. That's the implication shift. Not fear or speculation, but meaning, and meaning is what keeps people engaged. Now we need to widen the lens, not emotionally or speculatively, but biblically. Once Genesis is understood as recovery instead of origin, the story stops being small. Many think this idea, authority before Adam, judgment before Genesis, must be fringe, extra-biblical, speculative. But that assumption only exists if you're reading Scripture through a modern lens. The biblical worldview assumes something larger. It assumes structure. It assumes creation was never empty of intelligence. It assumes order existed before humanity and authority beyond the physical world. That's not an argument, it's how the text speaks. Long before Adam appears, Scripture uses the language of hierarchy, not human hierarchy, but cosmic hierarchy. Sons of God, thrones, dominions, powers, rulers. These terms are never introduced, they are referenced. You don't introduce concepts your audience doesn't understand. You reference what they already assume. The Bible assumes a populated, ordered, intelligent creation beyond humanity. This is why Job can speak of beings present when the foundations of the earth were laid, not as metaphors, but as witnesses. This is why Ezekiel can describe access, placement, and movement within the divine realm without explanation. In the biblical worldview, authority beyond humanity is normal. This is also why Scripture never treats rebellion as uniquely human. Rebellion is cosmic. It happens wherever delegated authority exists, and that matters. Once you see this, Genesis stops feeling isolated. It becomes part of a much older pattern. Authority is given, authority is tested, authority fails, judgment follows, restoration begins. That pattern doesn't originate with Adam. Adam inherits it. And Scripture never apologizes for this. It doesn't slow down to justify itself. It assumes the reader understands that reality is layered, physical and spiritual, visible and invisible, human and non-human, not competing but interacting. This is why later biblical writers speak comfortably about heavenly realms influencing earthly ones. Why Daniel can describe princes over nations, and Paul can speak of rulers not made of flesh and blood. Why Jesus can talk about authority being transferred, lost, and reclaimed. None of this is treated as strange because, within the biblical worldview, Human history is not the whole story. It's a chapter. This is where awe replaces skepticism. The Bible is not trying to impress you with mystery. It's quietly revealing scale. You're not reading an isolated account of humanity. You're reading a cosmic narrative that includes humanity. Which means Genesis is not small, it's foundational. It's not ancient myth, it's structural truth. And here's the restraint that keeps this grounded. Scripture never fully accesses the cosmic story. It doesn't explain everything or satisfy curiosity. The goal is positioning. The Bible assumes you don't need to know every detail to understand your place within the pattern. That's intentional. Once a story becomes too explained, it stops being lived. Instead of resolving the mystery, Scripture widens the frame. It lets you see just enough to realize the story is larger than you without pushing you into speculation. That balance builds trust, not excitement that collapses into doubt, but curiosity that grows into reverence. Because the biblical worldview is not chaotic, it is ordered. Authority exists. Rebellion has consequences. Judgment restores boundaries, and restoration always follows collapse. That's the universe Scripture assumes. Acknowledging that makes Genesis precise. Now it's not explaining the whole story, it's placing you inside it. That's the moment you realize this isn't just about before Adam. It's about how reality itself works. Now the story is bigger than history, theology, or curiosity. It's cosmic, and the most unsettling part, it's not finished. Here, where it stops being just ancient history. The mistake people make is assuming everything we've discussed belongs back then, before Adam, before Genesis, before humanity. But the biblical worldview assumes something unsettling. It assumes patterns repeat, not because history is random, but because authority, rebellion, judgment, and restoration are built into reality itself. The same pattern that existed before Adam didn't disappear when humanity arrived. It moved into humanity. Think about it carefully. Before Adam, authority was given, misused, order collapsed, judgment followed, and then restoration began. Now look at the world you're living in. Authority is still given. Power is still delegated. Structures continue to govern how people live. But rebellion hasn't stopped being a problem, it just changed form. Today, authority doesn't always look like thrones and crowns. Sometimes it looks like systems, institutions, technologies, narratives that shape how people think. Once again, we see the same cycle. Influence concentrates, truth bends, boundaries are crossed, order fractures, and disorder spreads. The biblical worldview does not treat this as coincidence. It assumes human systems mirror cosmic ones. That's why Scripture speaks of powers, principalities, and rulers, not only as spiritual realities, but as forces expressing themselves in the physical world. This is where it gets personal, because rebellion is never just out there. It always moves inward. Just like before Adam, when beings were entrusted with authority and chose autonomy, humanity keeps repeating the same impulse. I will define good and evil for myself. That sentiment didn't start in Eden. It echoes something much older. You feel its consequences every day. In confusion that spreads faster than clarity, in systems that feel powerful but hollow, in progress that accelerates faster than wisdom, and in institutions that grow stronger while meaning fades. You feel it in your life, moments where order breaks down, where something you valued fractures, where recovery becomes necessary. The biblical worldview assumes this pattern operates at every level: cosmic, civilizational, personal. Your life isn't random, your struggles aren't meaningless. They're happening inside a story that has unfolded far longer than you've been alive. Here's the part most people miss. Just as restoration followed judgment before Genesis, restoration always follows disruption. But restoration never happens without confrontation. Before Adam could rule, something else had to be removed. Before order could be reestablished, prior authority had to be judged. The tension we feel today, globally, culturally, personally, is not the end of the story. It's the pressure point before reset. That's why this matters to you. If the same pattern is repeating, what happened before Genesis is not just ancient info, it's instruction, context, and a warning. Once you start seeing yourself in that pattern, you don't just watch scripture anymore. You recognize it in its signs, cycles, and warnings. You begin to see why Jesus didn't speak of history as linear but repeating, why he said, "As it was, so it will be again," not out of fear but as pattern recognition. Something becomes clear. We aren't at the beginning of the story or the end. We're in between, inside a structure that has collapsed before and been restored before. That realization doesn't create panic, it creates clarity. If God has restored order before, then chaos is never final. But it also creates responsibility because patterns don't just repeat, they invite response. The real question now is not, what happened before Genesis? But what role are we playing now? That tension, this unresolved recognition, is exactly where Scripture leaves us. The Bible never explains everything. It positions you inside the pattern and asks whether you will recognize it. That's where the next piece matters. If restoration followed a judgment before Adam, and judgment followed rebellion, there's one thing Genesis never fully explains. Once you see it, you realize you weren't meant to stop here. Here, where the text does something strange. It doesn't conclude, clarify, or give a neat summary. It moves on. After outlining a pattern that spans realms, beings, systems, and souls, after showing that judgment is never random and restoration is never rushed, Genesis doesn't slow down or explain what that implies for the future. There's no checklist, no neat transition, and no moment where tension releases. Instead, the narrative continues as if the reader is expected to carry something forward. That's unsettling. Once you notice the pattern, you realize something else. The Bible isn't written like a closed system. It's a structure you step into. Some questions are unanswered because they're not meant to be answered yet. They're meant to be recognized. Recognition is different from explanation. Recognition lingers and follows you, not shutting off when the page turns. If it feels like something is missing, if it feels unfinished, that's not a mistake. That gap exists on purpose. Because the pattern doesn't end on the page. Genesis never pauses to explain what happens when the pattern reaches this point. It keeps going and leaves you inside it.